I want to start with a land acknowledgement. So I want to acknowledge that I currently am on Haudenosaunee land, and the Haudenosaunee uh, is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, and by honoring the sovereignty of the Six Nations, the Mohawk, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Seneca, and Tuscarora, and their land where I am situated and where our virtual coming together today is rooted. In this acknowledgement, I hope to demonstrate respect for the treaties that were made on these territories and remorse for the harms and mistakes of the far and recent past, as well as ongoing harms. I'd like to also acknowledge the stolen labor and lost lives of enslaved African people, the generational struggles for freedom, civil rights, and racial justice led by Black people in Buffalo and the wider region, and the persistence and destructive forces of white supremacy within and across our economic, political, and cultural institutions. We pledge to center the experience, the experience and lived experiences of BIPOC communities, to work in mutuality and solidarity with the spirit of reconciliation, restoration, and reparation, and to dismantle the systems of oppression and legacies of settler colonialism and white supremacy that continue to diminish, degrade, marginalize, and exclude BIPOC communities across our region. So thank you all for being present for that. I also want to acknowledge Buffalo. Sheila asked me to do this same presentation a couple of weeks ago, and I want to apologize, but also really thank you all for this space and understanding of why this presentation is today and not a few weeks ago. So just some, as everyone knows, on Saturday, May 14th, a white supremacist decided to enter a Tops grocery store in Buffalo's Black community to target and kill as many Black people as he could. This man live streamed his attack. It was very explicitly white supremacist, and 10 people in my community lost their lives. One of the women who was killed, Ms. Pearl Young, was a member of my organization, working to bring investment to the city and to the east side of Buffalo in particular. It's very likely that more of Clean Air's members are connected to the people whose families who have been lost and who have been impacted by this attack. I want to share that, when we are talking about climate justice, when you're talking about environmental justice, we also need to explicitly be talking about ending white supremacy and settler colonialism. So that is why I want to open with the land acknowledgement and with an acknowledgement of the people that were killed in my community and across the country due to white supremacist violence and gun violence more generally. And so Sheila, maybe if you could go to the next slide. I'd like to just take a moment to read the names and to honor those who were killed in Buffalo on May 14th. Roberta Drury, who was 32, Margus Morrison, who was 52, Andre McNeil, who was 53, Officer Aaron Salter, who was 55, Geraldine Talley, who was 62, Celestine Cheney, who was 65, Hayward Patterson, who was 67, Catherine Macy, who was 72, Ms. Pearl Young, who was 77, and Ms. Ruth Whitfield, who was 86. Thank you all. This feels especially resonant today. I picked up lunch. Our organization is holding a board retreat, and in the other room, and we picked up sandwiches from a local Black-owned coffee shop that is less than a block away from the Tops Market. And in Buffalo, it very much feels like we're going back to business as usual, where these folks were only just buried last week. Ms. Whitfield was buried on Saturday. And I think it's important that we continue to acknowledge what has happened and what will continue to happen until we all get really serious about ending white supremacy. And I know that I, as a white person, we have a real responsibility in ending white supremacy and speaking its name in all of the spaces that we can. So thank you all very much. Yeah, so I can introduce myself a little bit more. I have been, actually, if we could go to the slide with the picture of my mom. There we go. Yeah, so I have been doing community organizing work for over a decade in Buffalo, New York. I grew up working class in a multiracial but historically white working class community in Buffalo. The community that I grew up in was, very regular. My parents worked 9-to-5 jobs mostly. I have two sisters, one of whom is developmentally and intellectually disabled and requires full-time care from my parents. But I grew up really surrounded by my community. My grandmother and grandfather lived right around the corner from us. My aunt and my uncle lived right next door to them. And there were so many different church barbecues and backyard parties and, all of those different things that made me feel really rooted to the place where I grew up and that I called home. Last year, I actually bought a house. I bought my first house a block away from the house that my grandmother lived in and that I lived in right around the corner because this community is so important to me. I would say that my family did not care about the environment. They did not care about larger real social issues. My parents were very concerned about putting food on the table and keeping everybody okay, taking care of my sisters and I, going to church and things like that. And it wasn't an absence of care for larger issues or for the environment. It was just a lack of time and a real stress of the realities of raising children in this working class community. And so I say that because while my parents didn't, teach us very much about, I've never been camping, even I'm 32 years old, and there are lots of ways that I feel disconnected from my environment. There were also a lot of ways that the environment that I grew up in impacted myself and my family without us ever even knowing until much later on. So I share a picture of my mother, Julie. She was an incredibly vivacious woman. She was kind and sweet, and she loved cats. And she grew up in the house that my grandmother died in, right, in the same neighborhood as us. And then right next to that picture is a map of, if we can, let me make it a little bigger on my screen so I can be more clear. Whoopsies. 1 second. There we go. Okay, so we have some highlighted things here. On the bottom right corner there's a little highlight. A little bit further down there, Sheila. Nope. Down. Yep. That was the house that I grew up in, my grandmother's house. And then up the block is, yep, right there was a GM powertrain plant. And then along the river, the long one was the Huntley coal-fired power plant. When it was at the height of its production, was the largest polluter in all of Erie County. And just up the street there was Tonawanda Coke Corporation, which produced coke for steelmaking and was found criminally liable of clean air infractions. And in 2012, because of the extreme levels of benzene and other toxic chemicals that they were spewing into the air knowingly. I bring these folks here because while we may not have the extent of my environmental education as a child was playing outside in the yard, we were breathing in this smoke, we were breathing in these chemicals. I remember very vividly being in the backyard of my grandmother's house, playing in the little pool and wondering, what is that smell of burning rubber? What is that smell that is giving me a headache? And it was from these neighbors who were not good neighbors to the people that I loved. And in 2018, my mother had a stomach ache. She went to the doctor, and the doctor told her that she just needed to lose weight, that she now needed to stop drinking diet pop, and that, she was a smoker, and so to quit smoking, right? Didn't do anything else, no tests, nothing, until it was Ash Wednesday, and my mother ate a fish fry, and that Sunday, that fish fry was still in her body because there was a tumor that was so large in her pancreas that it closed her duodenum, the connection between your esophagus and your stomach. My mother was then diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and she was diagnosed in late February of 2018, and she died on April 30th of 2018. My mother was only 54 years old. She left behind myself and my 2 sisters. One of my sisters, Becky, who, like I said, requires full-time care from my parents. My 2 little children, who she loved very much, and 5 other brothers and sisters. And I share the story of my mother because she is very deeply why I work at Clean Air Coalition and why I continue to do the work of centering race and class in our environmental justice and climate justice movements. Buffalo has one of the country's premier cancer research hospitals, Roswell Park Cancer Institute. And when I took her to all of her appointments, I'm the oldest girl, so I don't know if others have that beautiful gift and horrible burden of being, in charge of everyone and everything in that role. And in one of her doctor's appointments, I said, why is this happening? Why is it that a generally healthy 54-year-old woman is dying and there's nothing you can do about it? And he said, well, remember, my mother is sitting right next to me. And he said, she's fat, she smokes, she won't stop drinking diet pop, and it's just bad luck. And I said, bad luck. It has nothing to do with the 53 site industrial zone that my mother lived next to for over 40 years, before and after the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, all of the things that so many of you and folks in our movement have fought for. And he said, no, there's no scientific proof that that pollution causes cancer, and your mother just had bad luck. And it took everything in me not to punch this man in the face and get escorted out by security. But my mother knew, and my family knows. And I know so many people in my community and in the communities surrounding me, in the communities that I organize in every single day, who have similar stories of not being heard, not being listened to because of who they are, right? And I also know that my mother was a white woman with insurance, and that I speak English as my first language, and I have a college degree, and I can be as eloquent as I need to be to speak to doctors, and yet she was still treated with such indignity and disrespect. And so I tell this story just like we start with a land acknowledgement, and just like we start with acknowledging the horrors of the violence of white supremacy, to remember the people that we are fighting for. Every single one of us on this call has someone that we're fighting for, whether we know them and we love them, or we have never known them and we will never know their names, but we are still doing this work in their honor, and to restore the dignity, care, and respect that these systems of oppression have stolen from so many of us, right? And that it's important. It is important for us to tell our stories, and to recognize that our stories are strategic and that they are powerful and that they help us to build power. So thank you for letting me bring my mom into this space. Sheila, if we could go back one slide, 2 slides. There we go. Nope, one more. So, nope. Yeah, there we go. So I just want to start us with some grounding principles for today, that it's okay to end with tension, that we need to learn the notes in order to play the symphony together. So there are many of us who are learning lots of different things, and that's great. One that I love and hold dear is that when you trust the people, they become trustworthy, and that trust is work and trust is a practice. That tension and discomfort help us to grow stronger together. So especially when we're talking about race and we're talking about class, if you are a white person, or if you're a person with class privilege, it can feel really uncomfortable to talk about things explicitly. It can feel really like shameful, or like you don't deserve to be in this work, or you can feel defensiveness. There are lots of different feelings we can feel, and I would just invite you to notice them and to hold them as we move forward. That this work is urgent and it takes a long time, and that we're taking on a small and important piece of a larger project together today. That we're a whole people and we want to honor our whole selves. We want to create brave spaces and have a commitment to informed and enthusiastic consent as a radical practice. And that we need to put love and justice in the front. And that's a quote from Ms. Lorna C. Hill, who was the founder of Buffalo's oldest Black-led theater company in Buffalo, who died of cancer, because of course she did. All right, so I'm going to share a little bit about clean air. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to share a bit about my organization, who we are, what we do, and then I'm going to walk through a case study that Sheila and I talked is a pretty okay example of how we organized through race and class for environmental justice. And then we're going to talk about some of the common barriers that we can feel or experience when we're trying to organize through race and class, as well as some bridges that we can start to build and practice to move through that. Then I'm going to share a practice called pies that we will use to then go into small groups and do some brainstorming around what you all can do at Mothers Out Front to practice really centering race and class in your organizing work. Then we'll debrief that conversation and come back, and we'll be done at 1:30. So I need to, or 2:30. So I need to get my butt in gear. All right. So if we could go to the next slide. Yeah, so Clean Air is an environmental justice organization. We do environmental justice, just transition, and public health work. We explicitly organize with poor and working class white people and communities of color for neighborhood-based and oppression, like rooted anti-oppression organizing work. We do our work in Buffalo, New York, and the surrounding suburbs, and we really hold dear to the values that we have as an organization, which is leadership development, environmental justice, democratic decision-making, both internally and externally in our larger world, honoring resident knowledge, race and class equity and inclusion, and appreciation, recognition, and celebration. And we hold on to these values. And I want to, I think a lot of organizations can sometimes like have values or have a mission and they sit on a desk somewhere. And I would just invite you to remember the values that you hold as an individual and that you hold as a collective when you feel a little bit shaky or lost about what's coming next. If we can go to the next slide. So just an overview, our environmental justice campaigns, we organize around a former American Axle plant, a GM plant on the east side of Buffalo, which is a historically and largely Black neighborhood. Tonawanda Coke, like I mentioned, we have been running that campaign for a very long time. And then Battaglia Demolition, which was a unpermitted concrete crushing facility in a very poor white community in South Buffalo, and high rates of asthma and all of that. Just Transition, we organized with current and former workers at the Tesla plant that is here in Buffalo for racial and gender justice inside of the plant. Huntley, we work, one of my colleagues is working now that the plant has closed to transition that site, which is on Buffalo's waterfront or Tonawanda's waterfront, to have it be cleaned up and to be redeveloped with community input and guidance and real accountability. We also work on the statewide level around proof of work cryptocurrency mining, which is just a whole nother thing that I never thought I would know so much about, but now I know a whole lot about blockchain and its environmental impacts. And then our leadership development work, right? So we have a membership team, we do grassroots fundraising, and we hold a number of trainings and workshops for our members throughout the year to build up and practice their skills. But more than that, we see training and leadership development as like an ongoing thing in everything that we do. I have a little sticky note on my desk that says if a member can do it, then let them do it. Yeah, I can say a little bit more about Just Transition. So we work with our partners in labor and in environmental, traditional environmental organizations, justice organizations, to root the transition that our country is having and our world is having from fossil fuels towards more renewable energy, and making sure that through that transition that workers are taken care of, that places are where there were former toxic facilities are cleaned up, and that community and resident knowledge is honored, and that we're building wealth inside of BIPOC communities and poor and working class white communities as we transition from fossil fuels into the next phase of our economy. I can put in the chat, or I can send to Sheila. Our work is really rooted in the work of Movement Generation, which is a collective out in the Bay Area. They have created or compiled, I think they would rather say, a just transition framework that talks a lot about the intersections and nestling of all of the systems inside of an extractive towards a regenerative economy, and how we can practice that. And with Tesla, so Tesla, the Tesla Gigaplant factory in Buffalo was given $959 million in public subsidies, which it certainly did not need, to create, with the promise of creating thousands of jobs. Over the past 5 years, they have created about 200 jobs and have stamped out a number of union organizing efforts at the plant. And we have found that we are organizing with current and former workers who experience an incredibly hostile, racist, and sexist workplace environment. So we are working with the New York State Attorney General to file a public lawsuit against the Tesla Corporation to change their workplace practices. So seeing how is racism and sexism being brought into the new world that we're building, we need to stamp that out from the jump. Okay. Great. So I want to share a story about our community advisory group campaign. We at Clean Air, so we started working at plants that were point source pollution, right? They were still operating, they were still filling people's lungs and bodies with toxic smoke and other chemicals. And now our work has transitioned, since many of those plants have closed down, to ensuring a fair and thorough cleanup of those sites. So in New York State, As a little bit of a background, New York State, like many other places, has two primary hazardous waste cleanup programs. The Superfund program, which is an enforcement program where a polluter is going to pay for the cost of the cleanup that is enforceable by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, or DEC, as I'm going to refer to them for the rest of this this time together. And then the brownfield cleanup program, which is a much more common and widely used cleanup program in New York State, and I'm sure a lot of other places, where new developers are given tax incentives to clean up hazardous waste sites and then redevelop them, and then they are reimbursed through tax credits. And so while, you know, our organization sees the need for both of those things, we also recognize that if things are going to be using public money, then they need to have public input. And that was something that really spurred up this campaign that we ran in 2020. So if we could go to the next slide. So at Tonawanda Coke, I've named our members there: Mr. James Jones, Sue Kelly, Gary Schulenberg, Maria Tisby, Tom Morahan, Joel, Nick, Kristen, and Ray. Tonawanda Coke operated for over 100 years. It was formerly owned by Allied Chemical, which is now Honeywell, and then transitioned to Tonawanda Coke in the 1970s. I would really encourage folks to read more about Tonawanda Coke and our organizing work. I will share our website as we go, when we close. But the long and the short of this story is that when the plant closed in the fall of 2018, Tonawanda Coke quickly went into bankruptcy. They filed for bankruptcy, and inside of their bankruptcy proceedings, a new developer, his name is John Williams, he's going to be a very important part of this story, bought the plant for $1. So he bought the Tonawanda Coke site, all of its holdings, for $1, which was about 136 acres. That is this awful mess that you see here, as well as a number of parcels that are right along the Niagara River. So we fought for a long time for the Tonawanda Coke entire site to be put into the federal or the state Superfund programs, because we certainly know that Honeywell International has the money to clean this stuff up, but we lost that campaign. And so this large part, the large 86 acres of the Tonawanda Coke site, is now being redeveloped by John Williams through the brownfield program, and another of small arbitrary carved out sites are being remediated by Honeywell through the state Superfund program. And then if we could go to the next slide. Oh, and let me say too that Tonawanda Coke, Tonawanda is a first ring suburb of Buffalo. It is largely working to middle class. It is overwhelmingly white, and the majority, I would say all of the members who are on this current campaign team are white people. So American Axle, with Miss Sydney, Miss Della, Miss Blue, Miss Shirley, Miss Shelda, Chris Moraski, Nyasha Hamilton, and Tom Morahan. American Axle was a former GM plant on the east side of Buffalo. Like I mentioned, is a historically Black community in the city of Buffalo. The GM plant ran for a number of years, employed thousands of people, and I will say thousands of Black people in union labor. And when GM went bankrupt in the 1990s, early 2000s, they set aside a couple of $1 million to clean up the known PCBs that were leaching into the sewer system and into the surrounding community. This plant is located directly next to hundreds of homes, an elementary school, parks, and sits on top of the largest trunk of the Buffalo sewer system. And so this is important because that top picture there is a picture of all of the PCB waste, which comes from oil that is stuck on to the sewer system directly underneath the plant. Folks in this community have really high rates of cancer, but they also have incredibly high rates of autoimmune diseases, especially lupus. And many people are sick, and many people have passed who have lived in this community for a very long time. The American Axle Steering Committee has been working to hold the New York State DEC accountable to use that Superfund money that GM had put away to clean up the site. But in about 2010, John Williams bought the building and all of its land and put it into the brownfield program to clean it up and redevelop it. And they carved out this teeny tiny little piece that is a Superfund, which just doesn't make sense to me. But I say this because when John Williams did barely anything to move this process along. We sent foil after foil, DEC calls, all like public pressure, community organizing, you name it. We built power in this community and he barely was taking action. However, when he acquired Tonawanda Coke during the bankruptcy proceeding and then put that into the brownfield program, a whole lot of things started to happen at American Axle because he knew that that the DEC was going to be looking at him. And that Clean Air organizes bread and butter campaigns in both of these communities, right? So, and again, this community, this campaign team is made up of all Black women, and all of whom are largely over 55 years old. So in 2020, we had lost our campaign for a Superfund at Tonawanda Coke. We were continuing to organize around American Axle, and we realized that the federal Superfund program has something called community advisory groups, which folks might be aware of, which gives community members in impacted areas a seat at the table of decision making, information sharing, and otherwise like respect and dignity as these hazardous waste sites are cleaned up. New York State does not have a community advisory group section carved into its Superfund or its brownfield programs. And we said, that doesn't make sense. Let's organize for one. So because we had a shared target, right, in the New York State DEC, and we had a shared enemy in John Williams, and because we had been organizing in both of these communities for over a decade, and our organizers and our past executive director had deep relationships with people in both of these communities, we decided to bring these two teams together on Zoom, because it was in the height of the pandemic, to talk about what it would be like if our teams joined together, right? Different problems, very similar problems. We have the same target, the same enemy, and they're very, very different people. What would it be like if these white folks from Tonawanda, who were organizing around Tonawanda Coke, which was made national news? If you talk about Tonawanda Coke with anybody in Western New York, they know the story, right? And American Axle, where it is a less visible, like there was never a plume of smoke, right, that you could see across the Niagara River. It is inside of the ground, inside of people's soil, inside of the sewer system, and with diseases that are often, we are told that we are crazy, or we're making up when folks have autoimmune diseases. So we brought folks together. It was messy. It was complicated. I had to talk a lot with the folks that I was organizing in Tonawanda and say, Ms. Blue and Ms. Shelda are not going to speak if they feel like you're going to take up most of the room. And we had to have really frank conversations with our white members to say, like, your stories are important and Tonawanda Coke is going to get the attention. What can we do to leverage the power that we have built in Tonawanda because of these different identities, because of the work that we have done, in order to support the work of this Black-led team and this Black community? And it wasn't perfect. I don't want to put sunshines and rainbows on this campaign because it was messy. But ultimately, what our two teams decided was to go after the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation to establish two different community advisory groups at Tonawanda Coke and at American Axle. So we could go to the next slide. So in the summer of 2020, we put our heads together. We, again, we're only working online because of the pandemic. We held online forums, we had conversations, we did phone banking, we had conversations with people, and we decided to partner with some of our legislators in the Erie County legislature to pass two resolutions in support of these advisory groups as a way to put pressure on the DEC to take action. Both of those resolutions passed unanimously, and I would say that that was a pretty incredible feat, even though it had no legal, or teeth kind of standing, because in Erie County, Buffalo is a dot of blue in a sea of red, and every single legislator voted in favor of these two proposals. So we won those things. Awesome. People were in the news. Our folks are building relationships with each other. We are holding cross community Zooms. Everything is peachy keen, right? And we can go to the next slide. Until I get a phone call from the head of the Buffalo region DEC, who said that the DEC is going to be putting together an advisory group for Tonawanda, but not for American Axle, because it just isn't hot enough. It doesn't impact as many people. People don't really care. Who's even going to come to these meetings? It doesn't have the same health effects as Tonawanda Coke does. I was flabbergasted when I got this phone call and pushed back on the racism that is very laden with inside of that. But I was only one person. So I brought this back to our campaign teams, and both teams said, immediately called out the racism inside of that and how a largely white community was going to get an advisory group, whereas a largely Black community is not. And they decided to take action. We called legislators, we did all of the traditional things that you're supposed to do, but I think one of the most powerful things that happened during this campaign was this op-ed that Ms. Sydney Brown, who is a leader in the Delavan Grider community around American Axle, and James Jones, who is a white man from Tonawanda, who actually had just recently retired from being the town engineer for the town of Tonawanda. So he wasn't like just some schmuck, right? Like he held a lot of power inside of the town government. And they wrote this op-ed, which I can share in the chat as well, around how calling out the environmental racism of the DEC and saying explicitly that if you do not give our friends and neighbors and comrades in Delavan Grider an advisory group, then this is not a win for any of us, right? That without justice for all of us, there is justice for none of us. We kept up the pressure. We made phone calls. I sent some very colorful tweets directly to the head of the DEC, which surprisingly he cares a lot about because he wants to be seen as really cool. And later that year, they announced that the Delavan Grider community at American Axle would have a community advisory group. The advisory groups aren't perfect. They are not legally binding. The things that we say don't have to be taken into account. Tonawanda's group meets monthly. American Axle's meets maybe quarterly. There is still a lot of inequity and disparity and a lot of work that we need to do. But it became clear of what was possible when our teams, who largely, I'll be frank with you all, only really met each other at our annual dinner or our annual meeting, right? actually got in the trenches and talked with each other and honored each other's experiences and the differences of those experiences, and put their money where their mouth is when it came to running and winning a campaign and claiming what could have been a victory as a failure of the state. So we can go to the next slide. So now both of these campaigns are in very different places. Through the, through our work in Tonawanda over the past decade, we've built a lot of relationships with poor and working class, as well as middle class white folks in this community. And after the uprisings, after the murder of George Floyd in 2020, we held a number of anti-racism for beginners. We have a really robust showing up for racial justice chapter in Buffalo. And there are some folks, especially people who we organize with, where jumping headfirst into that space isn't going to be the best fit for them. So we had some kind of soft but rooted conversations about race, about racism, about privilege, and what we can all do to end it with our folks in Tonawanda, which would not have been possible if we weren't explicit for a very long time about how our work around Tonawanda, Coke, and Huntley had to do with white supremacy, right? And in Delavan Grider, we are planning a campaign right now to do divestment work from the City of Buffalo's police department and reinvest it into an Office of Sustainability and Environmental Justice to make sure that folks across the city of Buffalo have the resources and the access to information and people and decision making that we need if we're going to survive this climate crisis, as well as the environmental health crisis that already exists in our soil, air, and water. But I would say that the folks on that team were not ready to say Black Lives Matter. They were not ready to talk about divesting from the police in any way, shape, or form. And frankly, didn't have trust in the other folks in our membership to really stand up and fight for them until they actually did it. So what are some of the lessons inside of this? Why did Sheila ask me to speak to you, Gal? Go to the next slide. So what made this kind of campaign possible was deep relationship building with members, with folks who we have been working with for a very long time. Celebrating and recognizing the small accomplishments and the small wins, the small bits of leadership development that people made possible for a long time, and really recognizing them and not just schluffing it off to like, well, we didn't win the big thing, right? So therefore we failed. No, like let's celebrate the things that we win as we go along. We're in it to organize for the long haul, even though, we do neighborhood-based organizing. We are constantly working towards the roots of these systems and naming them and being clear about them in our organizing campaigns, strategies, demands, and our leadership development work. These folks had a common enemy and a common target. We did training for a purpose. Our white folks went through anti-racism training, even if it was the first step in their journey, in order to move our campaign along, right? It wasn't training for training's sake. It was training for this action that we are taking on together unapologetically. And then I put this here because I didn't know how else to say it, but it's like teaching some of our members to be quiet with grace and love and purpose, right? And then to speak loudly when it is time to speak up. I would add that other things that made this possible was taking some really big risks. I did not fully know if our members in Delavan Grider were going to be down to work with some of our members in Tonawanda. It could have been a horrible disaster. And I was ready for that. I was ready for people to call me and say, what the hell were you thinking putting me in a room with these people, right? Like, we love them, but we're not working together. We just can't fit. I was ready for that. I was ready for this kind of campaign to flop and for it to be, we decided to run this campaign to prove that we couldn't win it to then go do something else. So then when we won, we were like the dog that caught the car, and thought, okay, let's figure out what to do with this and what we're building. And it takes making mistakes. We make mistakes. I, again, as a white person, organizing with communities of color, make mistakes every single day. And learning about how to learn lessons from them, to be humble and gracious and try again better next time, is part of the political courage that we need to end white supremacy, to end the climate catastrophe, and to all be free. So we can go to the next slide. So some of the common barriers to organizing around race and class, and I'm a talker, so I'm gonna just go to give you the answers, and then we're gonna do some things in small groups. So we can go to the next one. I'm curious how many people have heard or felt these different things, and I want you, again, it is messy, it takes a long time, nobody's messing up, everybody is messing up, and don't feel any shame, is how many people have thought or said, we just don't know anyone. We just don't know any communities of color. We just don't know these people. Climate change and climate justice is too big. It doesn't resonate with people. We can't get people excited about this. People don't care. This work is so urgent and we don't have time to change our strategy. People are too busy to do this work. I hear this a lot dealing with poor and working class people. They're just too busy. There's no difference organizing with poor and working class people and class privileged people. We're all the same. You could sub in communities of color in that sentiment. Climate change doesn't care about color, and that we need to work on big issues, not on neighborhood issues. I have felt a number of these things. I am a busy bee, and I think, okay, yeah, like I'll go to a training and then I will like figure it out and we'll be better next time. But actually slowing down or pausing or running at full speed and also bringing another runner to also go full speed with you, and centering race and class changes our strategies. And I want to acknowledge that that's hard, especially when we are beholden to funders or to larger organizations, to coalitions and things like that. To change our strategies is challenging, and also it is really worth it. It can be very, very worth it for us to build relationship, to build those long haul things, and to move forward, like intentionally messing up along the way and trying it on. So we're going to go into some small groups in a moment, but if we could go to the next slide. Oh, great. So we can meet people where they are, and recognize that race and class are already impacting the climate crisis, and that BIPOC and poor working class leadership is how we get free. We can celebrate, trust, and honor people's work and leadership, to see that we have to get to the root of systems and that they're all tangled up together, and to recognize that accountability is a verb and it is something that is constantly happening. Not a silver bullet, but just some ideas. And we can go to the next slide. So in our small groups, I think actually, Sheila, could you go to the next one? No, okay. I'm going to share my screen for a second, if that's okay. Because I added in a slide. One moment. Okay. All right, so we're I'm going to have a link to a Jamboard, and I can walk through how to use the Jamboard if folks need a refresher. But we're going to do an activity called PIES. And so this framework comes from Political Healers, which is a Black and women of color led organization that works nationally to center healing and radical organizing. And it stands for physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. And I use this this framework often because sometimes we can get really stuck in our heads and in that intellectual energy. And there's something that can be really exciting and challenging in thinking about what we can do or what we can say or how we can learn if we think about it in a physical, emotional, and spiritual sense, as well as our intellectual energy. So just to show folks the Jamboard, here it is. All right, so I'm going to share this link in a moment, but in your small groups, you will have an opportunity to talk about what opportunities or challenges do you see in your organizing work of centering race and class in your work for environmental and climate justice. And they can be questions, they can be cries of outrage, they can be critiques of me and my, framework. It's okay. It is all generative in trying this on. So you'll choose a sticky note here, type blah, 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 and save it. And then you can cancel, move it around how you want it to go. And so in the different rooms that Sheila will put you in, you'll use the corresponding Jamboard. They're all the same, and you can go up and down like that. And then when we come back, we'll have a conversation.
First got started, I think there were a couple people who, did raise those issues of, well, I live in a mostly white community and kind of some of the things.
Oops.
Oops, sorry. But then once we actually got talking, there were a lot of issues that people could organize around that I don't think immediately registered as race and class issues. So I think that was an important point that I wanted to uplift. Some of those being like labor issues. Like if you live in an area where your teachers don't necessarily live in the area, but they work in the area, especially because school boards are such a hotbed, I guess, for political activism these days. There's always opportunities to kind of partner around school sites. One of those we're doing in California is to get single-use plastics out of the San Francisco school system. A lot of people who live in San Francisco are very wealthy, but a lot of the students there and the workers there are from diverse backgrounds. And another thing that we're doing in California is we have another team that is pretty homogeneously white and upper middle class. And a simple change in advocating for, electrification in new homes from the single unit to multifamily unit is the way that, that team is approaching thinking about race and class and the implications that these campaigns can have for folks. So I think our discussion was really issues-based and teasing out these issues and thinking about all of the people who are affected, not even just the people who live there, but who works in the community, who can we partner with.
That's great, Alicia. That's really awesome to hear. And thinking about what I heard in there as well is where are there bridges? Where are there common targets, common enemies? And thinking about issues in a different light changes strategy, but ultimately, brings more people to the table. So I see Danielle, and then we'll go to Joni. Oh, you're on mute.
Hi, so kind of jumping off of what you just said, Emily, the through line that we kind of talked about on all of the different aspects of things that we thought could be more impactful for the work is just finding the commonalities. what is that one thing that can
Mhm.
unify us all? You know we have some neighborhoods have one particular issue, another one has this, but we all know there's a common theme about why these issues exist. So really rallying around that. And then someone had uplifted, there's people who don't necessarily feel comfortable talking about race and things like that. And, just from having participated in this, like we were talking about, just get people in groups of people who are also uncomfortable in the same way, so that they don't feel alone and that they can talk among themselves, because that's something I think that alienates a lot of people from this work, is that they think they should feel bad because the way they feel, they think they're the only one who feels that way. But it's like, it's not. I can tell you from a year and a half now of race caucusing, doing a whole bunch of things, affinity groups, and having just these conversations. And, it's not shameful for you to feel uncomfortable, and you should be in a place where you can feel that there are other people who feel the same way and that you're not alone, because it's really hard to get people to want to talk about things if they feel like they're the only one and they're going to just get horror gazes. I'm be like, because as much as you can say there's no dumb questions or no dumb thoughts, no one's ever going to believe that. They're always going to be like, I'm going to be the one out of the 99%. So really just, again, just finding commonalities within your own group of people who are like, yeah, we don't necessarily feel comfortable participating or reaching out to another group. It's like, okay, get those people together in a room. It's like, why are you uncomfortable? What do we need to do? Talk through these things. So that was kind of, again, it's just the key, just talk, share stories, figure out within your group, and outside of your group, what are things to help you move forward.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I really want to uplift that, like feeling uncomfortable is part of the work. And also, like, I think in our climate and environmental justice spaces, we talk a lot about like climate resiliency and resiliency. How many times have people heard that word? How are we also building up our resiliency in handling these hard things, uncomfortable things, not just by ourselves, but with one another, just like we are advocating for policy solutions that work together and are resilient. How are we also doing that inside? So thank you, Danielle. Joni, I'm gonna go to you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I just am really excited about this conversation because I think this is a key piece of how we're going to build a strong climate change movement that's going to be unified. And one of the pieces that I'm very involved with, because I come out of the labor movement, is that there's a huge gap from my perspective from environmental organizations and labor. And many times labor is blamed for not jumping in around climate change issues. And it turns out a lot of that is about the fact that this is their pocketbook. This is their bread and butter issues. And if they don't think that environmental groups have that in their sights, that impact, then of course they're not going to be interested in working. So when we talk about green jobs, or when we talk about just transition jobs, we have to make sure that we're talking about jobs that have labor standards connected to them, or prevailing wage standards connected to them. And just in terms of building relationships, it's totally okay to call the AFL-CIO organization in your state, or any of the unions that, the leadership of the unions, and just say, hey, I'm from Mothers Out Front, or I'm from Clean Water, or wherever you're from, and would like to have a conversation with you about the impact of X on your members, so that we understand more. We've had labor leaders come to our Gas Leaks Allies meetings, and it's just been huge for people to understand the fact that the companies, utilities, are choosing non-union contractors that are not training their workers, are not upholding safety regulations, and that it's just phenomenal, the issues that are involved. And so I just encourage people to, as we've talked about, take a chance, try reaching out to people and see what you can build. They are very, like the labor leaders that I work with around Boston have Mothers Out Front high in their respect. And it's because they've been fighting alongside, and that's made a huge difference.
Thank you, Joni. I'll share, yeah, that working with labor is so important, and building those relationships and being uncomfortable, and bending without breaking, right, on our values. I'll share, after this year, in our legislative season, we partnered with Blue Green Alliance, Sierra Club, and the operators union, who would get the jobs for Superfund cleanup sites, but do not get prevailing wage or any other union contracts on the brownfield. And we partnered together. We ran our campaign together, and we built a lot more. We didn't win, but we won relationship. We won steps forward. And it changed the way that legislators saw us when you had an environmental group with like the badass like operators union, it changed those things. And we still don't agree on a lot of things, and that's okay, but we're in that conversation. Susan, I saw your hand up. Do you want to share?
Okay. One thought that came up when I was listening to you. Well, first of all, I love what you did. What a great experience, what a great campaign this was. And I felt like, yeah, just do it, go for it, make it work, try your very best, and look at that. So, and then when thought came up when thinking about, people saying, well, white people, I live in a, middle class, upper middle class white community outside of Boston, people saying like, well, there's nobody I can talk to, everybody's the same as me, kind of thing. But we don't really understand who, lives in our communities. We all need to take a look at our communities. And I think we find that they're a lot more diverse than we think they are. The community next to me, which a lot of people think is, all white, is a third Asian heritage, and my community is fairly diverse. And we have had attempts and thoughts about going out and meeting people in all parts of our communities and building those relationships. And we need to move on that, because there's a lot going on here. So.
Yeah. And like we live in diverse communities. We're not seeing everyone. And also we live in diverse organizing communities. Like, I think when I was talking with Sheila about Mothers Out Front, and that I know a lot of folks are in Massachusetts, at a previous job, I worked very closely with Neighbor to Neighbor, and they're mostly their Springfield office, and I know they were doing environmental justice work around mold in a school with largely Puerto Rican Latinx folks, and I thought, oh, how cool to be putting together education, transparency, public funding, climate justice around mold in schools, right? So there are also opportunities in all of our communities to say, who are the folks on the ground that are doing the work, and how can we build with them, right? And maybe play that backseat role as we build trust, as we take time, as we, learn to be accountable, and make mistakes and try again. And what can that do for our movements as well? All right, we have about 5 minutes left before we close. Any other thoughts that people were having? Challenges? Alice, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sorry to jump in. And it's a question I've put in the discussion board as well. It's I can also even see from who's participating in today with their cameras on that we are mainly white women, and it's kind of I feel that it's kind of overall the organization, but obviously it's not like 100%, but still like there's a huge majority of white women. And I don't feel, maybe I'm wrong because I'm new to Mothers Out Front, and I'm not American, but I have the feeling that Roxbury or Jamaica Plains, like in the Boston area, like there's no Mother Out Front chapter there. Maybe I'm wrong. Or Chelsea or whatever, like less advantaged communities. And I'm just wondering, how could we as members of Mother Out Front and it's a question for all. It's not just for you, Emily. How could we be proactive in building or enhancing the building of chapters out there, and not only among so-called ourselves? You know, how do we cross that bridge that we don't even see is there, but is there?
Anybody have thoughts? Janet?
I'll jump in because it's something we think about all the time. I'm the organizing manager in Massachusetts, and one of the factors I just want to say to be aware of is that some of these other communities have very strong local organizations already, or they have struggling local organizations already. And we want to be careful that our goal is not necessarily to build a new chapter for Mothers Out Front, even though I'd like that in the abstract, but we want to be careful that our presence is supporting a local group rather than competing for energy and attention. So one way we can start is really the building of relationships and allyships, which I think some of our chapters have done already and we can continue to get better with. And then there might be some cases where there is no organization in it and it does make sense to build.
There's a couple questions. I'm sorry, I just wanted to uplift. There are actually a couple questions in the chat about Rochester and if there's an organization in Rochester. Does anyone know?
If there's a Mothers Out Front chapter?
Yeah, if there's a chapter.
Does anybody know that?
Rochester, New York? Is that the question? Who's here from New York? I don't think there is, but do we have any New Yorkers on?
I'm from Rochester, New York, and Gabrielle just said she is as well. But I was the one wondering if there is a chapter here in Rochester. I don't know.
There had been. Our old lead organizer lives in Rochester and was organizing there for quite some time. So I believe there was a group of people that was pretty active there that might have lost some energy during the pandemic. But if you provide your name to Sheila Keller, she can probably hook you up with the right people in Rochester.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we have a really great organizer in New York, or a great organizing team in New York. So either Alicia or Tatiana, I believe, can reach out to you.
Awesome. Thank you for lifting that up, Alicia. And Rachel?
Yes, hi, thank you, Emily, thank you for this amazing, wonderful afternoon. Yeah, I just wanted to touch base with Alice Plain, and I'd love to talk with you, Alice. We can connect later. I'm one of the co-coordinators of the Massachusetts Environmental Justice Team for Mothers Out Front. And we, as I'm piggybacking on exactly what Janet had to say, we are really focused on forming allyships and being active allies, not to go in, swoop in and start things in communities we don't live in, but to really actively be allies. And in East Boston, we do have a Mothers Out Front chapter. And there is a chapter in Jamaica Plain, and I think maybe, and there's in various parts of Boston. So I'd love to talk with you sometime, and maybe you'd be interested in joining the environmental justice. We have so much to learn. I just want to say the woman from Virginia, from Radford, Virginia, Trish, she was driving. The program, the campaign they're doing there is phenomenal. It's about all the emissions coming from ammunitions that are being decommissioned and all the toxicity. And it's the biggest thing, I think, in the United States, in this part of Virginia. And people are being exposed to carcinogens. And they're really working hard with a BIPOC community in leadership and mostly white mothers who are Mothers Out Front. I think we have a lot to learn from there. I'm sure Sheila's in touch with them, and all of us, I think we have a lot to learn from Radford, Virginia. I was so excited to hear about this. And it's a huge challenge. We want to definitely support you there, Trish.
Yeah. Oh, Gabrielle, I'd like to talk about Montgomery County, which is not related to this right now, but I want to thank you all so much for inviting me in to speak, and I want to really uplift Sheila. I've been a part of the Ann Braden program with Sheila for the past 3 or 4 months. And it's been really, really wonderful working with her, and you all have like a real gift on your staff to lead you through these training opportunities and practice. So I will put my email in the chat, but it's pretty easy to remember. It's just emily@cacwny.org. And I would also, I'm going to put that because, you know, we're a small grassroots organization, but if folks, part of our work is grassroots fundraising so that we can be accountable to our membership and not only to the foundations that give us money. So if folks want to support our work, we would be very happy to have you join our community. You can check out our website for additional information on these campaigns, and please, please, please feel welcome to send me an email or reach out to Sheila to get my contact information, because I would love to support you all in the incredible work that you're doing and the amazing work you're blooming into to really center racial justice, economic justice, and environmental justice in our movements. So thank you so much.
I just want to give a big put a plug in, and first, you know, again, really huge thanks to Emily for joining us today and sharing her wisdom. I feel like I could just sit and listen to her organizing stories for a long time, and hopefully you all felt the same way today, and that it will, you know, enrich our own journey as trying to become a better anti-racist organization and climate movement. So I also just want to put a plug that we are having a very intensive anti-racist training with AORTA, which is, let's see if I get their acronym correctly, Anti-Oppression Organization. They work on anti-racism and anti-oppression, and they're incredible. And I'm not getting their acronym correct today, but it is likely on August 13th and 14th for active members. I think we can sort of, if you want to reach out to me, if you're not an active member and you're interested in attending, I will also drop my email into the chat. That is a tentative date right now, but it's looking like it's pretty good to continue. So I know that folks who are here today are probably a crossover with people who would like to attend that one. And again, just big thanks to Emily. Reach out if you have any questions or follow up. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, feel free to unmute and give some applause for Emily. Unmute. Let's
Emily, thank you.
Thank you,
you.
everyone.
All right. Have a good day, everybody.